Hello,
wait for our mics to go on.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
Yes?
Yay.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to, as you may or may not know, this is going to be a podcast. It's also going to be being live streamed and all sorts, and I'll go into this. But this is like the first time we've done something like this with a live studio audience, as it were. So it's very, if you just sit there being
There'll be an applause sign, by the way, just so you know when to laugh.
If you sit there being really quiet, that is the best troll ever, but please don't do it. So what we'll do is we'll start with a massive round of applause, and it sounds like we're all having fun and all that, and then that's when we'll start the podcast. Okay, so that's the idea. So let's begin. Big round of applause, please. Thank you. Hello. That was very generous of you giving that to just me. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, Matt's going to edit that in over all his bad jokes later.
That's my text message sound now,
Yeah.
from now on. Well, welcome to a very special episode of GoTime. And it's not just a podcast. This is also real life as well, for those of us in this room. And it's a pre-conference social for one of the best Go conferences in the world, GopherCon UK. So we've got that coming up. This is also a part of the monthly meetup that is London Gophers, which we'll talk about a little bit more later as well, which is one of the best Go meetups in the world. So let's give it up for them.
Yeah.
If not the best in London. I think we can agree on that.
Best in the
And
world.
also, the other voice you can hear is one of the best Mark Bates in the world. It's Mark Bates.
That's right, that's me. Thank you, Matthew Ryer. I like to applaud myself, because most people don't. So thank you for having me. We're very excited. As you can tell, this is a very different Go time than we normally do. We're in front of an audience, like Matt said. Matt's wearing trousers, which...
That's actually what I'm most nervous about. It's
Yeah.
not having the live audience.
So we'll see if that in any way impacts Matt's hosting abilities over the next hour.
They can't get worse.
No, it really can't, honestly. We've got such a wonderful panel of people that we want to talk to, and so we're just going to obviously introduce them. I'm going to start with Liz. Liz Rice here. Liz, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thank you very much, Mark. Yes, so my name's Liz Rice. I run open source engineering at a company called Aqua Security, where we write lots of code in Go. So.
Oh, round of applause. We can't do a round of applause on the podcast normally. This is brilliant.
Well, we can. It's just very weak. It's usually just Matt. Again, he tells a joke and goes,
I'm going to
To
introduce...
be fair, there are people on Slack clapping along with you.
that is true.
Yeah.
Okay, then.
That's true. Sometimes they miss all the fingers off on the emoji when they clap to me, though.
Yeah, just the one.
Weird.
I've seen that too. Yeah.
Really strange kind of way.
I get that emoji a lot. It's weird. It's one off, I think.
I'm going to introduce another one of our panelists. I haven't made his name up. Genuinely, this is his real name. It's Gotham Reggae. Just imagine. Gotham, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, if you want to push it to the limits, I'm on GoTime. My name is Gautam.
Oh, Gotham.
It's pretty close by.
Very good.
And that's why they decided to get me on the panel.
What we really like doing is giving Matt, we tell him one pronunciation of somebody's name. Schlesinger, Borsico, Gotham. And we just like to see what he does with it on stage. It's quite fun.
Yeah, I'm much better in text.
No. So Gotham, tell us about yourself.
So, well, I have my own software company back home in India. It's called Josh Software. And Josh in my mother tongue means enthusiasm and passion. So that's what we do. We do a lot of consulting in Go and Ruby. And these are the only two languages we've been doing for the last 12 years. So
You don't happen to also maybe run a Go conference in India, do you?
Yeah, actually, I'm the organizer for GopherCon India.
Oh, there you go then. So if you want to go to India,
And just to let y'all know, the next time it's in Goa, which is a residential conference. That means all the attendees and speakers, we book the entire hotel.
wow.
And everybody stays together. So if anyone's interested in coming to Goa, which is like it's like the Florida of India.
So it's hotter than the rest of India.
The problem is a lot of people register for the conference but don't attend the conference because they're on the beach.
It's like really on-brand place name, though, Goa.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go in Goa.
Yeah.
Love it.
Couldn't have it in a place called Java. 'Cause,
You know, there's an actual place called Java that
Yeah.
you could have just actually used.
I'm much better in text.
Yeah,
Again,
what-
that's that single finger emoji. And in the middle here, we have Kat. Kat, say hi.
Hello, I'm Kat. I work for Monza, which is a company here in London. And I'm one of the co-organizers of London Gophers, together with Dom and Paul and Antonio. We're all wearing yellow t-shirts tonight, so if you want to chat to us, by all means come up to us and say hello. So a big thanks to GopherCon UK and GoTime for doing this together. This is awesome. And as always, thanks to our sponsors, Monzo Bud and Martin from Vistas, without whom we wouldn't be able to run our meetup. It's a monthly meetup here in London, so if you're local and you haven't been to one of the meetups yet, or if you're passing by all means sign up on the meetup page. We are organizing meetups every third Wednesday of the month in central London.
Fantastic. Do you have a Twitter account that perhaps people
We do,
can follow?
surprisingly, at London Gophers.
Wow, who would have thought?
And Kat, I noticed you didn't say your last name. Is that because you don't know how to read it properly? Like
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
It's another one of those names we give Matt.
It's Kat Jing.
Jing. Easy.
Gets better every time.
There you go, yeah. In addition to the London Gophers and all their great support and the support they get from their routine recurring sponsors, we also want to thank JFrog. Not for the people at home, they honestly don't know what's going on. But for you in the audience, those nice tasty beverages you got when you walked in the door, that was courtesy of JFrog. They sponsored the welcome drinks tonight. They have a little booth in the back where they're giving away lots of free stuff. So a big round for them for fitting the bill for tonight. Thank you.
And now, legally speaking, that's all the stuff that we have to say is now said. So now, we really are on our own. And this is normally when we do the podcast, the idea is we do the live show and it's kind of relaxed and we're not sort of too serious about it. And then hopefully they can find good bits to make into a podcast at some point. So that's what we'll do this time. So if it seems bad, it's not. That's just
It's
live.
an illusion.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention one thing.
Go on.
We have this Gopher plushie here, and this is a prize for the best question for tonight. So we're going to have some audience questions. We're going to take some questions from the audience at the end, and the best question is going to win the Gopher plushie.
And Matt does have a random gift he's been desperate to give away for
I
some
have
bizarre
a
reason.
GopherCon towel from the wrong
Beach
GopherCon.
towel. From, the wrong GopherCon.
Yeah, it's from the other GopherCon, but it's still a towel. And if you like being dry,
Is
So-
it unused?
it's unused. Yeah,
Yeah. I hope.
To be
wouldn't
clear.
be dry.
It is a soiled beach towel. So for all you British gophers out there, you love going to the beach. So next time you're sitting on an umbrella in the rain, eating an ice lolly in a sweater, you'd have a lovely gopher towel underneath you.
That's why it's soiled, because we sit on soil. So
This is what happens when we go off script.
Oh yeah.
See, look, now you're just moaning at us. Okay.
Yeah. That's fine. Moaning is acceptable because at least you can hear it on the podcast, and it backs up that we're here in real life. And otherwise, I do think people are going to question that.
Fair enough. I think we should start.
I think we should start
Yeah.
too. Today, we decided we're going to start by talking about the sparkle emoji in the standard library. Again, I am better in text, but it's the sparkle, it's the gold in the standard library, or the magic in the standard library. The bits,
I actually pinged Gotham and I said, we're going to be talking about the gems of the standard library. And he goes,
The hidden
well, it's just the wrong
gems.
conference. We're supposed to be talking about, that's Ruby.
yeah.
And I was like, yeah, so we're really on point with the name of this. Absolutely, because none of us know what it is.
Yeah, it's the bits of the standard library that each of us have kind of fallen somewhat in love with to varying degrees. I've fallen in with mine a lot in love, but others maybe not so much. So, well, exactly. Just a quick example of something that would hopefully get cut out of the podcast, so no one even knows about it. But the editors are, I
would be
won't say lazy, but they leave it all in, basically.
Well, let's start. I think we should start right here in the middle with Kat. Kat, can you give us a little nugget of gold, a little something that maybe the audience here may or may not know about in the standard library that you just love and kind of think, oh, wow, I wish more people knew about this?
So I hope everyone knows about it. If not, they should definitely look it up. And my favorite one is context. I think I just find this surprisingly, the most usable day-to-day package for me, because it just solves a problem that I've always had Like my background is in PHP, so that's a lot of web applications, a lot of requests and responses. And I always struggled with like how much data do you pass along and where do I pass along this data? And I ended up having like function names with 14 parameters in because you needed to pass in all the data. And then when I started doing Go and I discovered context, I'm like, this is a solution to that problem. And it's very elegant. And that's only one side of the package. It's a really like weirdly split brain package because on one side you've got the params that you can pass in the context. And then on the other hand, you've got the whole like Go routine management side of things. So with context, the cancellation and timeouts and deadlines. And I find that this is just a great tool to manage your channels, your Go routines and everything. And it's very elegant, it's very simple. It's an interface with like 3 methods or something. So
4, I think, yeah.
4, yeah. Because the request params is the 4th one. So yeah, I love it and I use it pretty much daily.
Could you give us an example where you've abused it? You've done something
I've
you probably shouldn't have with context?
No, so I've been very good at like making sure that I think the only rule with the params side of things is just pass in params that don't change throughout the life cycle of the request. So I didn't cheat, I didn't put my database connection in there or something. So I've always avoided this. I've been a good citizen. And then I remember like reading a bunch of books which all used context for examples of deadlines and cancellations and timeouts in a really clever way. So I've tried to do that. I can't say I do this a lot day to day because it's like most of the time when you use libraries, it's all taken care of for you. Mm-hmm. But under the hood, it still uses the context. And then when my request times out, I see in the logs like context timeout. So so I'm like, yeah, context.
So for anybody that doesn't know why that got a laugh when you said you don't put the database connection in there, maybe we should talk a bit about that because when you do use the values inside a context.
Yeah, which is the context with value, right?
Yeah, context with value.
Yeah.
They're sort of hidden dependencies, they can be, can't they? So
sideline APIs, often referred to as.
The problem, like the main gotcha with this is that at no point in the life cycle of your like thread, you don't know what's inside the context and you don't have a list of the values that you can access, so you have to know that they're there. So the kind of gotcha with this is like only use values that throughout the whole life cycle you can expect that value to be there, and also not mission critical values. So if it's not there, it's not the end of the world. So a very common use case is log parameters. So if you want to log something and you want to add a bunch of metadata to your log lines, then you can store them in the context, but if they're not there, it's not the end of the world because they just won't get logged. Like the app still runs, it's fine. Whereas if you rely on your database connection being there, and by the way, like context values are not guarded in any way against being overridden or changed halfway through, you basically have no guarantees that what you put in at the beginning is the same at the end. So,
I always say they should be like user request specific.
Yeah.
Like, things that you would get necessarily like if someone made an HTTP request, so like a session ID or user ID, like things that are kind of very specific to that
small,
request,
specific, and constant, and not mission critical. So.
Yeah, I think most microservices are now just coming up with a paradigm where you must have the context passed around everywhere, interfaced properly, and a context. And if that happens, you actually have a lot of control over what's happening. So definitely helps.
Yeah.
I like the fact that the done method returns a channel, which gets closed when the context is cancelled. So then if you do have concurrent code and you use the select block, it's very easy for one of the cases to just be the done of the context, and you can do other things, and it'll keep doing those other things until that context gets cancelled, and then you can gracefully shut down. It's actually a really easy way to do graceful shutdown.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts is the fact that, so if you're unfamiliar with it, the way you create context, you're actually continually wrapping them. So you're always kind of creating this node of context, which means you can start with, say, the user request. So on HTTP request, there's a context. So if the user shuts their browser, for example, that context gets canceled. And you can use that as like your primary context, let's say in a web app, and then spawn that off to other things, and they can wrap that with their own timeouts, their own cancellations, their own values, and it all kind of trickles down, or just this little bit cancels itself.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really clever pattern they used to do that, the kind of node.
Yeah, I think the cool thing as well is like the context package itself. Like I'm a bit hazy on like the implementation details, but I know that it can like flatten itself or like unpack itself. So like if you have a bunch of nested context, you call this like context something something, that you can just like unpack, like flatten the context to the most recent values.
Okay, that's new. What is that?
I've seen that, and that's why I said I'm a bit hazy on details. But there is a way to like, if you have a bunch of nested context, and like if you call that function, it will like bring up the sort of the compound context with all the ones that were nested just flattened to the top.
Interesting.
I need to dig up the name.
Yeah, I'm curious. Send it to me. Or post it on Twitter so everybody else sees it. Don't just send it to me
I'll do
privately.
it now.
Show notes later.
I want to get smarter than you, so don't send it to them. So you don't know you say you don't know the internals. If you've never seen it, Francesc Campoy actually did 2 videos for Just for Funk about context when it first came out. And one of them I think is just truly wonderful, where he basically rebuilds almost the entire package from scratch. And it's really clever, and I highly recommend you watch it because it shows a great use of Go routines and channels and kind of keeping all this stuff in play and how these context cancellations and stuff work. It's an excellent, excellent video.
Brilliant choice, Kat.
Yeah.
And would you say you just like the context package, you love it, or you're in love with it?
I love it because it makes my life so much easier.
Right.
Like I find it just the most useful day to day because so at work we actually have a thing where like our request struct, like an internal request thing, it sort of inherits the context interface, so you can pass interchangeably the context or the request, and that just makes life so much easier. That I just love it because if our logging library requires the context for all the extra params, but I can just pass in the request and I don't need to do any marshalling in between or anything.
Oh, so they've implemented the context interface itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then you can provide your own context objects like
Right.
that, can't you?
Yeah.
And Buffalo does this too,
Yeah,
doesn't
Buffalo does that. We do it in a lot of projects as well. Yeah, and it's a pattern I recommend people actually use. And a
Yeah.
lot of times you just kind of embed a context.context, which is obviously not very good for the whole don't stutter and go thing. Everything's just context.context everywhere. But you can kind of take in the context that someone gives you and then build your own and do different things with it. Maybe provide your own value implementation, which is what Buffalo does. It kind of has a map of your request parameters and stuff like that.
You can also do it the other way around. So like if your struct implements the context interface, like your code that then can deal with either the native context or the struct, and then check like, oh, if it's this struct. So for us, for example, it's a case of like our requests have a context, but then our logging library checks that if the thing passed in is actually an instance of that request, not just the pure context, then you know that the request struct also has a bunch of more details that you can fish in and put in the logging library. So you can kind of do it the other way around as well. But yeah, it's seamless and it's so great. And I do it, I use it every day. Every time you implement a handler, you encounter the context. So
interestingly also, we are always talking in the context of a web request. But I mean, I have seen a couple of cases where people have misused or wrongly used the context. Just because it's cool.
In a command or something, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, and
I'm
then you
one of
end up
those
doing
people.
context of to do. Like,
Yeah, well, so
just put
I've
up a
used
dummy
it-
context and move ahead.
I use it in a command. So I'll have the main function will trap the signal, and I'll cancel a context, which I then pass into just some other run function. And Dave Cheney told me off on Twitter for doing this. Right.
That's Dave.
But that's Dave.
Yeah.
But because he said it's for requests only, but in a command, in a way, I think that
Is
is
a
the
request.
request.
Yeah. It's a
What do
user
you mean
running
by
the
command?
CLI.
You mean somebody at a CLI typing in a command?
Yeah. So because
so that could.
That's a
fit.
request.
That's a request.
Yeah.
I'm asking you.
I
to
would do that.
something.
I often pass context in as
Well,
the first value to a new, for example.
where were
depending
you
on
when
it
Dave
doesn't
was
even matter
having a
where
go
it
at me on Twitter?
Da-
Too little, too late.
Yeah.
No, but here's the thing.
Who trusts what Dave Cheney says, really?
So that's an example of something that might actually get cut out. It's quite exciting when you hear them. You
Everybody right now is tweeting at Dave.
Yeah.
Mark just said, what is Mark? Yeah, who's Dave, really?
But the thing about the command and using requests and contexts in that sense is if you're doing some long process, if you trap the signal, then that's Command C will cancel that context and you can just unwind everything.
Yeah.
It's a properly nice way to do that graceful shutdown. So it fits perfectly.
I agree.
I think that's nice.
So
Yeah.
you need to be able to use it. I've seen cases where we're using MongoDB, and there's a lot of context being used, and I've seen code where people have like, dude, I don't know why it's there, so I just put a dummy context and make it happen, and that comes and bites you later on.
Yeah.
Because suddenly your context is changed from a request. So when people are building bottom up, so you build your code first, and then you have an API added to it, and that context is misused, you just have context.true there.
Yeah.
And the HTTP request which finally comes through is not using the context there, and it's failing. And you do not realize it until all your test cases bypass it. And you realize it in production. And that hurts. So you have to be a little careful.
I never got that to do. I actually
Yeah,
don't get that.
the difference,
Context to
so
do.
context.to-do, it differs from context.background in that they're the exact same thing, but the idea is you can grab for to-do in your code.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if you don't know what to do, you can't. Well, let's just always do that.
Right.
Let's
If
just
you
write
don't know what
JavaScript.
to do, if you don't know what
Yeah.
to do, just to do.
If you just can take anything to do. Anyway,
So-
cancel.
So I have actually a question for the
I
panel.
just cancelled the context.
Yeah, you did. Good job. We're almost at our timeline, by the way. We're almost
Yeah.
exceeding that.
Time out.
So I actually have a question for the panel. So when they introduced context into the standard library in 1.7, right, obviously they tried to retrofit it wherever they could. And because of that, we now have like this exec with context, or like, command, exec.command, exec.command context, right?
Yeah.
Where we now have two versions of every API, or a lot of APIs. The SQL package has a very
Cassandra as
similar
well.
thing, right? What do people feel like? I mean, do you feel like you should also offer two implementations, one that has a context and one that doesn't? Do you think we should only just take the context and...
The only reason there's two is because context came after, and they have the
That's
version 1
almost what I
backwards.
just said when I said they retrofitted in 1.7.
And they have a backwards.
It's almost the same thing. I mean, not quite. You say it a lot nicer with the accent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm giving people a treat.
You really are.
It's not a treat here. We're in London. Everyone talks like me. They know I'm shit. That's going to get cut out, I think.
But let me ask the question to the panel. I mean,
It's the compatibility promise, isn't it?
Right.
You can't introduce something like that and just, context is useful. I think we just established that. So what other options
so let me rephrase the question. In Go2, the infamous Go2 comes out alongside TextMate 2, Perl 6, and all the other ones. So when Go2 finally comes out, and we're all out of the game because we've retired for 20 years, should they remove the non-context versions?
I think I wouldn't necessarily say like remove. I mean, in 2, yes, because you're not bound to with the backwards compatibility promise. And I feel like because context provides an easy way to just put in a dummy context if you don't need it, even if every function requires it, there's just an easy way for you to not use it if you don't want to. I feel like if there was no context background or context to do, it would be kind of unfair to always force people to have the context. But because you have an easy way out, I don't see a problem with just forcing it for every function. Like, it's kind of become a standard anyway, where the first param is always
Right.
context anyway, so.
Which has led to so many fun proposals on Golang issues, right? Of
Yeah.
do we have some sort of current context that we can just grab? We don't have to keep passing it around.
Yeah.
I don't think we have time for that discussion.
I wouldn't mind a copy context. IO copy with a context.
Oh,
so you
yeah,
could
that'd be
cancel
quite
that.
nice. Like just, yeah.
Yeah.
And someone did write one. There is one that you can use.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. it's very
Okay, I think...
We should move on.
yeah, I'd
because-
love to hear, obviously, some other ones.
Yeah.
Gotham, tell us a little bit about your favorite parts of the standard library.
So when I started writing, what is the interesting part, I realized that, everything's about the name. So my favorite package, luckily or unluckily, is the regexp. Not because it's my surname. My surname is R-E-G-E, and it's there in the package name. But I actually genuinely like regular expressions, and I think it is one of the most important things to learn, not particularly in Go, but in general. So I always say that if you know regular expressions, your Linux command, and Vim, you're a programmer. All right, so all the Emacs haters out there, too bad.
Other IDEs are available. I should just say that.
Yeah, we don't discriminate against IDEs,
Yeah.
except for TextMate 2,
Yeah,
which hasn't come out yet, so you're good.
Gonna be good then.
recently I looked at the regexp/syntax package. And that's pretty neat because
it?
it's got a lot of information about the various nuances of using regular expressions, including your named captures and your greedy searches in the right context with the Perl-based as well as the ASCII-based syntaxes. And I think it's a must-read for everyone, if not to use it, and stop using Stack Overflow or Google to find out what is the fastest way to find a regular expression, copy-paste, and put it in, because it causes problems later on.
Especially if you copy and paste from the top, because that's the question. I make that mistake all the time. And I just got this on
Dude,
Stack
that's-
Overflow. Yeah, from the question.
That's
None of it works.
That's taking laziness to the next level.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
I
the
hope it's-
syntax package is amazing because it really does show everything. There's more to it, obviously, and there's a lot of stuff. There's actual code that happens in the syntax package too. But the documentation at
It's
the top
fantastic.
is fantastic and worth it alone, and I often refer to it, like
And
daily.
a lot of times we don't end up using the captures, which is, it's been there since regular expressions ever evolved. But we tend to miss out and write a lot of more code trying to just use substring and parse and figure it out, where captures would actually just give you the array back. So
Can you give us an example where that's really helped you in your code? Like, apart from just simple regular expressions, like, I don't know.
let me think about it. But there
Let me
have been
think
cases.
about it. Yeah, we got
Yeah,
time. We'll wait.
They're
Yeah, so-
editing this later. Take your time. it's
Yeah.
fine.
So there was a case where we were trying to map out the entire URI, like with the username, password, host, port, everything together.
So you wanted to write your own URI.parse.
It turned out to be a nightmare because somebody just tried to go the distance saying, oh, the host could actually have a.b.c.d, and they started using a substring
Right.
and iterating over that. And then I saw the code had already become like 100 lines of code, and I'm like, dude, you've not heard of captures? You just capture it and just match it. And it's just easy sometimes to look at the documentation first and implement it. But it's a common mistake.
So when you say captures, for those who maybe not know the regex package, because that's kind of what we're here for, what do you mean by captures? Just the parentheses?
Yeah, you were trying to match a group of parentheses with or without greedy searches. So you want to actually find out if, say for example, if you want to match just a subdomain. But a subdomain could actually go really, like if you look at your the canonical name for an AWS host, it's huge, but it has everything in it, and you want to find out just the host name, not the rest of it. You can always capture it without greedy searches, or you can find out if it is matching the right pattern using captures, the parentheses, in your regular expression just to check. Well, there are ways that you can even replace stuff in it, but not recommended for readability purposes. But if you're just getting through the regexp syntax package, there's a lot of clarity which comes out. You can even name a captured field. It'll get you back in a hash with a named hash, so you can actually process it better.
That's pretty cool.
That is cool.
Yeah.
My problem with regex is it's too easy.
Yeah,
I like
that's
it.
everybody's problem.
I like a challenge. That's like, what? Okay.
Stack
Oh, that's
Overflow.
clearly human readable. Yeah, like let's make it a bit more difficult. Yeah.
But yeah, once you learn it, though, of course.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's fun because then you're not just coding to finish a job, but you're actually doing it well.
Yeah. You're
Then-
casting spells as well at the same time.
And I'm not gonna lie to you, it feels amazing when you get a regex that works.
Yeah.
Like truly amazing, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
I
You're
don't
like, I won the internet today. I got the regex to compile and do what I wanted it to do.
I love those like regex 101 where you can go and like live test your
gonna
regex.
say.
And it's
Yeah,
brilliant.
but
You
it's-
spend hours of fun.
It's like
figuring out how to break
online
somebody
regex
else's regex.
generator, or rubular.com, which is for Ruby.
So there's actually Gobular.com,
Yeah.
which does Go regular expressions. Whoever wrote it though was an amazing developer, and they wrote it in Buffalo. And they're really handsome.
Yeah, but the interesting part about Rubular and Gobular
That would be me.
would be-
Just to clarify, not Matt, because
Sorry,
that's who Matt's like. I don't remember writing that. I did, but yeah, it's Rubular for Go.
So how did you check your side? Because I always wonder, it's like a chicken and egg with those like online regex checkers for like, well, if we check our regex with them, who do they check with? Kind of thing.
They use the
We compile
Regex.
it and we use the regex. I use the
Yeah, but
regex
like-
package
but
and
if
give
the-
you the result.
But if you think about it, like if there's a bug on that website, then like everybody else's regex is wrong, and like they obviously can't find their own bugs.
No, because you just give me a string of regex, I run it through compile, and it either
True,
compiles or not.
yeah.
It's not like I'm sitting there parsing, like I don't have a big regex that parses regex. Like, if you think that's what I'm doing, like on my weekends.
That'd be an
I-
easy project.
So we come back to the regex package. Right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So there is still like a chicken and egg, because then like if you just run it through compile, then what checks compile?
Well, the Go team
Who checks the code?
checks the Go
Anyway,
team.
dead end.
All right. Didn't need this.
No, but it's a good point
Microphone.
that Kat brings up. Who watches the regex watch people? We may never know.
Yeah. Funny enough, I've run into a few cases with regex where like something works in one language and doesn't work in the other language, and that always puzzles me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like your last name.
That just doesn't compile anywhere.
It just doesn't compile in my brain. Not when I see it written down.
I believe the Go does implement Perl-style regex, correct? Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Not the PHP one, because that never worked.
Yeah,
Like
it
the
definitely
cross, yeah.
doesn't match Ruby's either.
Yeah.
There are a few places where Ruby doesn't match.
Interesting,
Yeah.
which is why I think everyone should actually look at that package documentation because you know there is one way to do it.
Yeah.
That's the only way you want to look at it.
Can't argue with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and often if you read the documentation, you'll see cool things like at the top, like you can do :alpha,
the
right?
ASCII way.
And that's all of the alpha characters. Like you don't have to specify them. You can do :digits and like all these kind of
Yeah.
nice combinations of that very readable words as opposed to /D or /D and slash
Question
whatever.
for you: does :alpha cover all the kind of accented characters and like
So
non-Roman
alpha is
characters?
only for ASCII,
Just ASCII.
just ASCII.
Okay.
So that's the only ASCII way. So that's the problem with wide chars. So if you're doing wide characters, regular expressions is another beast.
So what about UTF-8? Right? I mean, Go has UTF-8 support built in. If you range over hello world Chinese characters, you're going to get, the nice spaces and the indexes are going to jump appropriately and you get a full character. Unlike other languages, you get a third of a character, right? How does that actually work with regex? I mean, are you able to regex over
I think wide
UTF-8
character support is there for regular expression support already.
Okay.
And I don't think it gets to UTF-8 because then you need to actually, suppose you're looking at maybe some Japanese or Chinese character, one kanji, you cannot compare it with UTF-8. So you'll actually have to have the regular expression support wide characters for it. I haven't tried it because I have not got down to typing out one of the kanji's stuff in a regular expression. It'd
Right.
be fun, but it should work. It should support it.
There you go. Fantastic.
Great.
Love it.
Yeah.
One of
Sometimes
my
on the
very first professional jobs was doing double byte character support in a 3270 emulator, if I remember rightly. It was horrible.
Now she can write the 3270 emulator in 20 minutes on stage for fun. She cracks her knuckles. She goes, hang on.
Just get my computer out.
Yeah, exactly. She'll do it for us by the end of the podcast.
But Liz, you were mentioning earlier about IO Reader and IO Writer.
Yeah. So when we were first discussing doing this podcast and this topic of the gold in the standard library, one of the things that strikes me, if you think about the whole of it, is how prevalent really nice interfaces like IO Reader and IO Writer are, which mean you can easily kind of plug and play with different, things that you want to input or output, and also the richness of the things that you can plug into that interface. So you want to write out some JSON, that's there for you. You want to write out to a file, that's there for you. You want to write out to
They're brilliant,
trying to
simple
think of another
interfaces, aren't they? They're
output
just
thing.
so
They're
simple and brilliant.
and they're so pluggable and so testable, which is great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
my favorite part of the IO Reader and Writer is the design they've used for the interfacing. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just something that you should actually look at, get into the details of how it's designed, and try to implement something like that in your work. It really helps.
And the
So
number of
beautiful,
times
smooth.
where we have, somebody says, oh, it'd be really nice if you could output this report in a different format. And you go, well, okay, fine.
Yeah.
Do
Just
that.
give me a
It's
different
easy.
writer, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to gzip it, boom, still
Yeah.
just a writer. The bytes buffer, just a writer file,
Yeah.
just a writer. And what I love about them is the symmetry of the read-write interface. They're identical.
True.
It's just read and write, and it's just beautiful symmetry between the two, right? They're identical looking interfaces, and it's very beautiful. It's
Yeah.
just very clean, isn't it?
And I think it'd be hard pushed to find another language that has that kind of breadth of similarity between what the interfaces that you get from different packages. I think it's
I
a
think
beautiful thing.
The real magic as well, I think, is the fact that they're single method interfaces.
Yeah.
So an interface with one method is so easy to implement, right? It gets implemented a lot, and this one, that's a good example of it. It's very exciting when you're doing your own projects, when I feel like it's a discovery, like you discover a single method interface. And then you can do things like the trick of using other types as the base and then implementing that interface. like Handle Funk does it for handling.
Yeah, that's. I actually showed that in my workshop today. That's one of my favorites. Just the way GoType systems work, where you can say type handler func is a func that takes a response writer and a pointer to request, and then on that you can implement another method that calls itself and implements the HTTP handler interface.
Yes. So then, when you need to use that type, you don't need to implement that. You don't need to build a struct and implement that type. You can just use a function.
Yeah.
So that it gets used even more. But I agree, reader and writer, and they are quite strange, I think, when you first come to Go. Seeing a read method that takes in a slice of bytes and just returns an int or an error is a strange thing, but it kind of really reflects what's really happening under the hood.
Absolutely.
So it has that mechanical sympathy.
I think for me, it was more just like, this can't possibly be it. Like, that was my take. Like, when I first came to it, I'm like, it's just one method. How is that writing? Like, isn't there other stuff I need to do when I'm writing stuff or reading stuff? And yeah, there is, and there are other interfaces, right? Maybe you want to close it, and there's a closer interface. Like, those are just amazing interfaces.
Yeah.
I can see why you like them.
I do.
Yeah, we should all.
Yeah, and there's so much about the standard library that gives you just so much power out of the box. So the other thing that kind of struck me when we first talked about doing this podcast was, well, HTTP, net HTTP, everything you need to write a website right there in,
Buffalo
1 or 2
users,
lines
don't
of
listen
code.
to her. She doesn't know what she's talking about. You need Buffalo.
But the fact that you can get a web server running in, and I think you made the point, Kat, about one line of code, it's amazing. And again, point to another language where that's possible. It's out of the standard library. It's really nice.
Well, I think what I love about that is, most standard libraries have web, right, packages. And they have, like Ruby, for example, has the ability to a built-in web server called WebBrick, which kind of gives you an idea of how good a server it is. It's called WebBrick. Right? Yeah, it's beautiful. But you wouldn't use it out of the standard library. You use Rails because it's not useful. It's not designed well. And those packages in the Ruby standard library just aren't able to do what people needed to do, and that's how things like Rails came up. With Go, I mean, admittedly, obviously, as a maintainer of Buffalo, I've got different end goals, which are more development, user development and stuff like that. But just to sit there and say, listen.serve, here's a function, and serve this function.
I think the first time I saw
amazing.
it, however many years ago, when I first saw that, and I was looking at it thinking, how can that possibly be it? A bit like what you're saying about IO Reader,
How does that work?
Surely there must be more to it. And then you realize, well, actually, no, there's a ton of defaults that it can take care of. And if you want to mess with those defaults, you can, but you don't have to. And ta-da, website in one line of code is nice.
What I love, too, is you can actually turn that then into an SSL site with 2 lines of code. Right? You can take the same muxer that you just used, the same handler, and just do Go, listen and serve on another port. And now you've got port 80 and you've got port 443 running simultaneously because you've just launched the same muxer in a different Go routine on a different port in 2 lines of code, which is really, really cool, right? You don't have to really stretch to get there, do you?
Yeah, and I like that it's pretty safe to use for beginners as well, because things like request timeouts or connection timeouts, it's not something that you care about when you first start programming. Whereas this one, you just do one line of code and you're excited because you've got a web server running, and then if you want to dig in, you kind of have. I really liked one of my favorite things about Go is if you go into the source code, they have really nice comments that then become the GoDoc source. And it just really explains what everything is, like the connection timeouts and request timeouts, and you can kind of dig in a bit more and learn a bit more about how HTTP works under the hood, but you don't have to care if you're a beginner. So it's like a very low barrier to entry. And I remember this struck me a lot when, so there is a book called The Philosophy of Software Design by, I think it's John Osterhout, and I've probably butchered the name. But he talks about deep modules and shallow modules, and he gives that exact example. So in Go, you've got say with the IO, with the reader and writer, you've got an interface with one method, and it's kind of a deep module because as a user, it's just a black box that you call. You don't care what it does under the hood. You don't need to know in order to use it. And if you want to, you can dig in a bit more. And he compares it to Java, where in order to do in order to read a file, you need a reader, and then you need a buffered reader, and you need a string buffered reader, and you have to know how this works in order to use it, and that's the difference. So that's why I like Go, because HTTP is another example of you can just call it out of the box and treat it like a black box, or you can dig in, but you don't need to. And I feel like that's the genius of the design of those packages.
I think the standard library really does it very well. So, I've had lots of conversations with the Go team, and I remember I was having one with Steve Francia, who's one of the program managers for the Go team. And we were talking about just this, and he said, the standard library is designed to be building blocks, right? You can start there, and then layer on top of that more abstractions if you need them and other stuff. Like the SQL package, if you ever use a SQL package, it's very raw, right? And it feels quite clunky and cumbersome. And the reason is because that's the building blocks for building more abstractions on top if you want to, right? And the same thing with the HTTP package, right? There are times where I'm like, oh, it doesn't do error handling. Like, I wish it returned an error, But that's fine. You can then build an abstraction. I actually just did this a little error check thing that takes a handler, returns a handler, or returns my own type of handle that returns an error, and I can do the error handling now in one place, right? But it's a little abstraction I just build on top of it, and the standard library lets you do that because it's so easy to work with in that way. All right, and that's how everybody has their own HTTP router now.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a nice segue to the other package that I think Gotham mentioned, which was the HTTP util single reverse proxy, which is another thing on top of HTTP. That is very elegant.
So tell us about that. What's the single reverse
So
proxy?
this was something that came along. It was not something that I was searching for, but if you ever get a chance, have a look at HTTP util single host reverse proxy method. So basically, if you want to modify the response that is going out on your HTTP server, you can intercept any kind of these responses and make whatever changes you want. So because you have a reverse proxy there, you can basically tag it along with a particular URL. And so think about this. How easy or difficult is it for you to intercept a redirect request from a server? So by default, we just think it's a browser thing, but it's a server who's sending back a 302. Can I intercept that 302 request and maybe make a change in the token, the JOT token, or maybe change in the URL that is getting sent back? We can do that. So if you use a single host reverse proxy method in that, it helps you modify the response. There's a method called modify response, where you can actually take back the status code, modify the response, and send it back seamlessly. It's you'll probably do it when you're in Aqua Security. I'm pretty sure you'll probably do that. Because if you have to say preempt somebody from accessing something, this is the easiest way to just deny. So instead of returning a 302, you change the status code and return a 402.
Yeah.
So things like that are a lot of
One
fun.
of my favorites is actually the exact opposite of that, which is the round tripper interface in the HTTP standard library. So I love it. Do you know? You're looking at me like, what is that?
Yeah, I've used it, and I'm trying to remember what for.
It's one of my favorites. Now, if you read the documentation, it goes on a client, right? So HTTP client has a default round tripper, which is HTTP-based requests. The documentation will say if you want to change how the transport mechanism works, maybe you want to use file as a transport system. So, Unix, socket files, for example, right? So you could write your own implementation that does that. Maybe you want to use a database as a transport mechanism or whatever it is, right? You can do that. You can kind of plug this in, and it takes a request and spits out a response, an error on the other side, right? So you can control the flow, but I actually, according to the documentation, says you're not supposed to modify the request. You're never supposed to use it for this. I actually love it for that. So one of the things I like to do, I do with a couple things, is I will create my own round trippers to do, say, add a JWT token to all my outgoing requests, right? So I provide one client that everybody uses, right? And inside of that, it'll automatically tag with JWT, right? Or stuff like that. I also use it in tests. It's a really fun way of capturing and replaying back third-party APIs, right? So in your tests, like you're doing an http.get, you can change the transport mechanism. So instead of going to Twitter or Facebook, whatever you're trying to hit, you can just return back your own stuff. So it's incredibly useful for testing and kind of mocking out the other side of the HTTP GET, right? Because it's easy to mock out your own server, right? But sometimes it's just easier to capture a payload from Twitter, store it on disk, and just replay it using a transport.
That's really
right?
cool.
So it's like the other side of the
That's
reverse
kind of-
proxy
that's really
coin.
neat.
It's
Yeah.
the outgoing part.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite little bits.
Yeah. We used reverse proxies for a very specific use case at the previous company, and that was we had a legacy application, and we kind of wanted to use the strangler pattern, so you sort of slowly carve out, so you like strangle your old legacy app by slowly carving out bits of it and putting it on the new stack. until eventually the old thing can just die because nothing's using it anymore. And so we had this problem of, we had a website and we wanted some of the parts of the website to be served by new services and most of it still go to the legacy servers. And so we had to put something in between, and we used a little essentially reverse proxy. And I remember like my manager coming to me saying, can you write a reverse proxy in Go that will help us do this? And I was like, oh my God. And then I discovered it's one line. You just called a single reverse proxy, job done.
Yeah,
and
like, I'll give it my best shot. Might take me a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
That's what I did. That was my holidays.
I'm going to go work on it at home. I'll see you in a few weeks. Come back with a tan.
Yeah, I was genuinely scared. I was like, oh my God, I don't know. And then it's one line. So it's really nice. And it gives you a way to basically receive a request and then decide, okay, if this request comes with this domain or based on whatever params you want, you just direct it to one service, otherwise you direct it to the legacy app. And that was really nice, and it was really easy. And it was really nice to have that routing logic in a separate Go app. So
yeah, and you get to use Go code to make these decisions.
To do it,
yeah.
Really.
One of the things I've played with, and I never actually got a chance to finish it, so with Buffalo, for example, we watch your Go files, and as your Go files change, we rebuild it. And if there's an error, we display that error back to you from the building, but we do that with kind of like just faking it out a little bit, using a file and then serving it, and it's not particularly good. And one of the things I played with is a reverse proxy, where you actually, when you go to port 3000, it goes to this kind of dev dashboard thing and proxies it through to your application, which is now running on a different port. And if that crashes or whatever, we could just proxy that error back to you. Well, I just need more free time. But it's a wonderful, wonderful tool if you've never used it. So speaking of time, Matt,
Yeah.
it's 7:50.
I thought you were going to talk about the time package.
Why? Time is on my
Right.
side, mate. I don't need to worry about it. No? Okay, fine.
Well,
We can cut that out later.
yeah, don't worry too much about the time. At some point, things will end, and then
Well,
we'll be
I'd
fine.
love to give these lovely people a shot at asking some of our fine panelists some questions. Maybe win that gopher and that used beach towel of yours.
Great idea. Soiled.
Soiled. So, hang on a sec.
Oh, we
Paul
have some
Jolly, where are you, sir?
We're going to have some
Oh, and
room.
Dom.
He was our mic gopher. He's what? He's at the dinner. He left. He's like, I'll
Dom's gonna
volunteer
do-
to walk around with the mic. Thank you, Paul. He went to dinner.
Did he take the mic to dinner?
He
or-
did.
Yeah. So
Yeah, that chewing you hear in the
let's just
background
turn-
is
yeah,
Paul.
let's just turn it on and see what he's having. Hello, we're going live over to Paul.
I assume they're live streaming it. Can't they just send us some questions from dinner?
Okay, so we got, Dom's gonna walk around. We got a question right over here down front. Very first hand, over here, Dom. See my finger? I'm point over here. Dom. Oh, okay, sorry.
Magic.
Oh, I'm looking this way. You got that lovely yellow shirt. How am I supposed to see him?
really bright.
Yeah. Have you ever used the len operator on a buffered channel, and why?
The len?
Yes.
That came up today, I think, in Corey's.
Do you mean the capacity?
No, because I don't use buffered channels.
That's for buffer channels, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you can also set the capacity.
Well, you can read the capacity, you can read the len. So the capacity, if you have a buffer channel of 10, the capacity would be 10, and the len would be 4, maybe. That's how many are
Yeah,
in
but
there.
you want to be
Right.
careful using it because you'll probably get an inconsistent result.
Yeah, it's not
not
thread
safe.
No. And you shouldn't be using buffered channels, so it's not a problem.
One use case for buffer channels that I find to be great is when you want to control how many active Go routines are running. So if
Yeah.
you wanted to limit them, what you can do is create a buffered channel, and then at the start of when your Go routine is going to do some work, or before that, it puts something in the channel. So say you've got 5 slots in this channel, the first 5 of those will be fine, and they'll unblock, because there'll be space in this buffer. The 6th one is going to block, because this channel is full, and then it's going to wait until, and then what you do at the end when you've finished processing, you read from the channel to release that thing in the semaphore, and that then leaves a space for the next one to go in. And that's a way you can throttle, without much otherwise complexity in the code, you can throttle how many concurrent things are going to run. And the code stays relatively easy to read. It's really
I got
But
asked
at that
about
time-
worker pools just the other week, and that was exactly.
See, I do it
What I'd
I kind of do it
suggested.
the opposite way, where, let's say, I have a channel of stuff. I want maybe 5 Go routines. That's my limit. And they're just ranging over the channel, so whichever one picks it up first does it, and then I don't have to use buffer channels.
I do also strongly believe that you should know the number of Go routines which are going to be spawned, and if it's going to be dynamically increasing, it can actually create more problems everywhere. So I won't still recommend using len on a buffer channel at any time because it's risky. But the pooling of Go routines or throttling them or limiting them over this, I think we could debate on that one.
Okay.
We should.
Well, I know it works.
It
Here's
works.
the thing, I
It
don't
works.
just kick off loads of Go routines. The kicking off of a Go routine is what's blocked by that channel.
Right.
So I do know
Fair
how
enough.
many Go routines are running at
Exactly.
Well, that's
one
cool.
time.
Yeah, that's cool.
It's about readability. It's easier to read. But no,
Fair
we'll
enough.
go in
Yeah,
the car
yeah.
park after and take our shirts
No,
off and have a full fight.
Well, that-
No props.
There's a knife fight
And
going to happen over this.
No,
Okay,
not a
fantastic.
knife.
Brilliant.
The
Next
person with lesser
question.
hair wins.
Okay, Dom's got a question over there then.
As in, can I ask like a non-technical question? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess my question would be, because I'm kind of like new to like tech. What would be like if your life was like a storybook and like each chapter is like a year? What would be like a name of like an influential chapter? Like for example, an answer for me would be like chapter 22, like it's GoTime, because that's when I started learning Go. And so, yeah, it's more of like
And
a general
22
question.
is your age, and that's the chapter.
Well, it was my last age. Yeah, chapter 2
So
was
every
like,
chapter is a year.
yes.
So
Every
that's a long
chapter in my
chapter.
book is 21. I'm just.
So you're asking us what we'd call the like current year of our lives?
Well, I mean, you can go for current year of your life, but like more like an influential year in terms of, or anything really, like a current year, or a year that might be influential to you in terms of like your growth as a technical person.
Some
it's
of
more like
us have been at this for 20.
well, I mean, you can do something like
gonna take
chapter
a
like,
while.
It's going to take a while.
well, you just pick one year, like, chapter 22, that's when you're
Pick 1 year.
22.
For me, it would probably be the very first year I professionally started programming, which would unfortunately be 20 years ago. I'm dating myself, but 20 years this year.
You're dating yourself. Is that like a new app? It's for people who can't find love.
Well, personally, I think I'm quite fanciable. So yeah, I take myself out to the movies and dinner. I treat myself right.
Yeah, but why is it not going very well? That's the thing.
It's really not. I've broken up with myself several times, especially the past few years. But for me, it was actually my very first year of programming because if you don't know my background, I actually have a degree in music. And so obviously not computer science. So when I got my first job, it was the .com boom of the 90s. And if you could spell HTML, you got a job. And if you knew what it meant, it was like another 5K a
Y2K.
year. It was wonderful.
And Y2K.
Yeah, exactly. So like 1999, and I happened to find this job in Boston where the developers on the team were just spectacular, and they were more than happy to sit with me and teach me and show me how to write code and how to write good code and how to read code and how to understand code. And so to me, the lessons I learned in that very first year of programming have stuck with me to this day, and it's one of the reasons I quite enjoy mentoring, because it was such a big part of my learning process. Because in 1999, we didn't have a ton of books on programming. We certainly didn't have tons of online resources and videos and conferences and all this sort of stuff online, so you could only learn from other people. And that, to me, was the most valuable thing of that year, was learning from these professionals and these people who knew what they were doing and taught me some wonderful things.
That's lovely. Do you stay in touch with them?
I absolutely do, yeah. I have some very good friends that we still see each other. I was just at one of my friends' house about a month ago having dinner. Yeah, so I still see these people 20 years later. They were at my wedding. I was at their wedding. Just lovely people. Yeah, we still stay in touch.
Thanks to Ben for that really complicated question. Does anyone want to ask a more complicated question? Because that was too easy to try and
Should we go
think
towards
of
the back?
your
Come
life
back
as
to
a
the
novel.
end?
Yeah.
It's
I didn't give it a name, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a name for it.
Don't worry, we'll do names later.
The
Fair
marksman.
Oh.
Oh, sorry.
That's one of those things we can cut out for Gotham now.
You get one cut each.
You get one
You'll
cut
have to
each.
embarrass yourself once.
Matt, you've used like 10.
Okay.
So you're ready
Yes.
for a question. So I'm not really sure because one of you is really biased in it. But when is the point where you start using a web framework? what would you say?
I'll stay away from
Yes,
the question. I do have a valid answer. Well, I think it's a valid answer, but I'm going to stay away from it.
Mark's basically like the Clippy version for Buffalo. If it's like, oh, it looks like you're trying to write a web app, it pops up on the screen somehow in the corner.
So my real quick, but I'd love to hear others take, obviously, because I am slightly biased. But I'm biased in that coming from something like Rails, what I loved about Rails was the productivity gains, right? Like I can very quickly write a very small app, but when I start writing a large app, the structure, the kind of complexity that comes along with large apps, and templating and sessions and cookies and databases and all that sort of stuff, there's just so much kind of boilerplate you have to write, and that's where I turn to. I used to turn to Rails, and now I turn to Buffalo, right? Because it's the Go version, and I can just get up and running, and I can start writing my business logic. That's when I turn to it. I don't always use Buffalo, though. That is actually true. I don't always use it because it's not always the right solution for what I'm looking for. But I'm curious to see.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I like the question because you need to use the right tools for the right job. So if you actually want to build a web application, you might want to rethink about using Go in general. You want to use a web application?
No, that's the wrong answer.
Hang on. I'll cover. So if you want to just build some standard API work that you want to do, just use Rails. But I'll give you an example, and Mark, you'll actually like this, but we needed to put out a very lightweight web server on a Raspberry Pi. And I didn't want to install anything on it. That's the time I actually used Buffalo. And I bundled up the entire in one binary and just put it on a Pi. So there are use cases where you want to use Buffalo exactly because there is no dependency for installation. But if you want to build a larger web application, just use the right tools. And sometimes, I found using Rails for the front interfacing for API versioning, whichever way you want to look at it, and scaling it up, but do all the heavy lifting, maybe using Go. So use multiple languages, be polyglot, be available so that the right tool is being used for the job. And personally, if you're writing a web application in Go starting from scratch, as long as it's a simple, small application, you're okay. But as the complexity increases with the databases coming in and your rate limiting and versioning and middleware, it just starts getting a lot of lines of code, and people have already done it. So if people have already been there, done that, don't go reinventing the wheel just because you want to use Go.
Or use the solutions that are already built in Go.
Yeah, I tend to agree with, I think if you're new to programming, I think that looking at a massive framework can scare you off, and you kind of look at it and go like, I don't know what anything is. So I think with the framework, you kind of have to know already what a framework, what MVC, what all of that is. So I think if you're just trying to learn programming, I think it's better to start with just sort of like a native little app with no bells and whistles, no framework, so that you can really understand the concepts under the hood. And then if you've already done it once in another language or something, then yeah, by all means, don't reinvent the wheel. Another way to go for me is, it's something that we do at Monzo, is we don't use frameworks because we have microservices, but we use a combination of libraries and code generation. So we basically bundled all the common logic in libraries that every little microservice inherits, and they're all code generated. So if you want a new service, you just code generate a service template. They're all homogeneous, they all inherit the same libraries for authentication and logging and requests and all of that. So that's another way to go if you don't want to use like an MVC style framework.
How do you describe the services at Monzo?
Microservices.
What do you mean? I mean, how do you describe them?
Blue,
how do you define
little.
They're single responsibility.
Sorry, when
Yeah.
you say like something gets generated,
Yeah.
what does it get generated and what does it get generated from?
So it gets generated from templates. So we have an internal tool called Service Gen, and we just call that, say like, give it this name of this service, and it just generates the empty.
Creates like an empty service.
Yeah.
I see.
It's
Okay.
basically just like a.
So the
you just need to
boilerplate.
So yes.
So you just
with
have to
that,
put
we
in your
fulfill-
domain logic.
So you just need to fill in your handlers, your proto definitions, all of that
So
stuff.
I think the answer is it depends.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess that would be fulfilling the same kind of function that a
Yeah.
framework might give you.
Yeah.
You have a homegrown
I think like
framework.
it's basically to sum up, like it's worth doing it once from scratch so you understand it, because nothing will teach you better than like rewriting writing a simple context package or writing a debugger from scratch or something like this,
So,
because that
but
really
that's
teaches you.
a like I'm trying to learn perspective. Like
Yeah.
so
Right.
for me, like as a consultant, as somebody who builds a lot of apps, like for me, time is of the essence. Just getting to
Yeah.
market, getting the thing out, right? So that's when I would absolutely turn to a Buffalo or previously Rails, where it's just like, boom, I can start business logic, somebody else has made all the decisions for me, and I'm good, right? But just like in Ruby, I would use Sinatra for some really small things where I didn't need a full-blown Rails app, right? And in Go, I still turn to the standard library when I just need a small, quick, tight little web app, and I don't need the bells and whistles,
I think
that comes
that's
along
true,
with it.
particularly if you're starting from something that you don't really know where it's going. If you go straight to a framework, you're going to be locked into the opinions of that framework.
Yeah.
And if you know that the opinions of that framework meet what you're going to be doing, then great, it is the right tool for the job. And if you haven't figured that out yet, then maybe it's too early to adopt a framework.
Yeah.
That's actually a really good point, because a framework is something else to learn.
Yep.
However simple it is a new thing to learn.
Yeah.
And yeah, in the beginning of projects, you don't really know ever what you're going to be doing, I think.
Yeah, and if you lock yourself into a framework, it's very hard to get yourself out of the framework.
Yeah.
Like after a few years of development, it's gonna be very hard to leave that framework. But if you don't have a framework, it's a lot easier to migrate into a framework, I find.
Yes.
Well, I always say build small things, and I don't mean like therefore don't have big companies and stuff, but actually, if you can avoid it, don't have big companies. It's way easier when
It really
things
is.
are small.
Let's try to get another question in. I think we beat web frameworks to death.
Ben's winning so far because he asked us to.
So,
do that
Dom,
to the
who's our next question?
We had one over the back over there, and then I'll come back to the front, and then we've got...
Okay.
This is for the prize. Is this the last question?
Oh, there we go.
Hello. Going a bit back to context, right? It's a quite elegant solution. It's a quite good way to give timeouts and deadlines for functions, and I use a lot for HTTP handlers, web services. But the thing is that I usually see most of developers, they never get the context and check if it's canceled, if it's done, or whatever, right? So they always delegate to a third-party library to do this decision. And then if the library returns an error, blah, you bubble it up, you deal with that, and you know that the cancel was canceled. So what do you guys think, and how much do you guys look to the context to cancel your code itself,
So I think so for anyone that didn't hear that, it was talking about a lot of the times you can see context just passed through. The methods themselves that you're writing don't deal with it. I think that's totally legitimate. If you're calling some other service and it's cancelable, and you're allowing that to be cancelled somewhere else upstream, sometimes it's completely appropriate to just pass that straight through and don't touch it. But whenever I'm doing any kind of heavy lifting, looping around, I will at the top just check. And you can also check the error on a context.
Yep, that's one of the four.
One of the four methods is
an error.
error, and it returns either nil if everything's okay, or a context cancelled error. So sometimes you don't have to even use the channel. You can just check that error, and if there's an error, you know the context has been cancelled. I think you just return the error from your function.
Well, it doesn't, so by default in the standard library, though, they're context deadline errors. However, if you implement your own context interface, that error can be anything you want, right? You can cancel the context with done, and the error could be the database doesn't exist, right? It's not necessarily a cancellation error, is it? You can still cancel and give a better error, which is very good for Go routines because it's hard to propagate errors up a lot in Go routines, isn't it?
Yeah.
Unless you use like error group or something.
Right. Yeah, so I think it's okay to just, if you're not sure, but you know that you're going to be doing something as part of an HTTP thing, then you could use that context and just pass it through. The request comes with a context, and that does get cancelled if they do the back button or they refresh or they close the browser or whatever. Modern browsers will cancel that context. So that is quite cool if you're doing some heavy lifting and doing some work, and you actually can abort early and not do any work. It's quite satisfying.
Yeah, it's also
clean up all that stuff that maybe got opened that's no longer useful anymore. Right.
I'd say it's just a safer habit to have as well, because if you think of the alternative, which is not pass it down, then you can have something further like downstream that expects that context and it assumes that it's the one passed from the top, and then something in the middle, if it starts a new context, and suddenly you lose that, and it's a mess. So I think even if you're not planning to use it, it's just always safer to pass it down because it saves you refactoring later, and it always ensures that it trickles down rather than somebody randomly overriding it with context background because they haven't had it passed. So.
Yeah, and it's a completely new context almost. Like you can just keep wrapping, remember we said about the nodes, so you can even wrap smaller, tighter cancellations on bits of it.
Yeah,
as
like
opposed
passing
to
it
the whole
down won't
thing.
hurt you, but not passing it can hurt you.
Yes. Yeah.
So don't not pass it.
So great question. I think we had one more question. Is that right, Dom?
Got two more. One in
Two
the
more
middle and one-
questions. Okay.
We still have the plush gopher to give away.
So none of your questions have been good enough, apparently.
I think Ben's, I mean,
Which one was Ben's?
serialize your life.
Oh,
divide
it's a
your
book.
life
Yeah,
up
that actually
into
was quite
chapters.
good.
That was
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah.
It's complicated. To be honest, it's more complex than regex, that question.
Well, just parsing the question. Yeah, it was a good one. Okay,
Yeah,
so we
I
got two
didn't
more.
use the-
So first one, I don't know where the
Forgot
mic
about
is.
the captures.
Speak.
Hello.
There you
Hello.
go.
So this question is a lot less technical than the others. But I read an article earlier, and it basically said that the next top 5 sites for fintech locations would be London, Singapore, Belfast, New York, and Dublin. As a local guy myself in Ireland, I thought it was flattering that Belfast and Dublin got the mention, but I'm skeptical about who done that research and whether they were from Ireland themselves. What I wanted to ask is, considering Brexit and the implications that could be coming up, luckily for all of us here, London is number 1. But if you were not able to be present in London and program here, whereabouts in the world would you go to be a Go developer?
I enjoy Boston, but that's also where I live. I don't know. Personally, I think that you can do the job anywhere. It really doesn't
would-
matter. Live where you want to live.
I was going to say, I would encourage looking into remote work if that's your thing. Like, it's not for everyone. Some people like going to the office, and that's completely fine. But if you're not particularly attached to the office, if you then have the whole world of companies that you could work for. So especially if you're in a place which doesn't really have many native local companies, and you want to work for amazing company X, if they hire remotely, that's your chance. So
Yeah, in fact, talk to GitLab. GitLab doesn't have an office. I was just talking to somebody earlier, and that's so cool. So they have so many people all over the world, but they don't have a single office location. I don't think geography matters anymore.
Yeah.
I think so too. My team is remote, and most of the company at Aqua is based either in Israel or Boston, so I know I'd have like a home to go to
And
if
yet
I
you
wanted
never
to go
come
to
to
one of those
Boston and
two.
visit me.
I do. I just don't see you.
You're like, I'm there every 2 weeks, Mark. Thank you, Liz. Yeah, thank you.
Classic burn. Good
It
one,
really
Liz.
was a classic, right?
Really
It
good.
was good. I make an effort to see you every time I'm in London.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Yeah, that's also a lie, but that's beside the point. Yeah, so remote. And we had one more.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we
Oh,
can.
there we go. I'd like to ask you guys about the singleton pattern. I know it's a very controversial design pattern, and with Go you can sort of implement it using package level variables. And I've seen it being used mainly when it comes to configuration. For example, using the Viper package. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on the singleton pattern, whether it should be used, whether it should not be used. Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. And for me, it's don't use it. It's as simple as that. And actually, don't use any global state. In fact, maybe even in the next version of Go, we get rid of package space, global state altogether. If it's a config, you can just pass a config in. You don't have to be, it doesn't have to be a singleton, you know? And it's clearer, I think. It means that the dependency is clear that it's needed. It's not just any, because if it's a global space, anything in that package can access it. So you don't really know the flow of where that thing's being accessed. You'd have to go and find it. Versus if it's passed in, it's a bit more verbose, but it's infinitely clearer. So I probably wouldn't use the singleton package.
Yeah, I think it does complicate things a lot. So you avoid using it, but if it's being used in a package, so be it. But don't try to get around a singleton pattern or try to break it. just let it be there.
It makes testing harder as well.
It does.
Yeah, it absolutely makes testing harder.
Yeah, often in tests you want to try it with different config in that case, or different state. And you want to also be able to run your tests maybe in parallel or concurrently, and in different orders and stuff. And if you've got this state that's sticking around between then, it's kind of awkward and can create interesting and strange, weird bugs that take a while. If you avoid global state, Peter Bergen said it very well. He said, if I had to give 5 words to a new Go programmer, they would be don't use global state. He didn't even use the last word. That's how confident he is that that's right.
I think it was do not, actually.
No, it wasn't. He'd used the contraction. And that's Peter.
And that's just terrible English as well, right? It's just, yeah, I mean, obviously, the only thing I would say to that is the asterisk of unless you need it.
Well, yeah.
Well, no, I mean, like, like that is 100% solid advice. Like, try to avoid it. But like everything in life, like, sometimes there might be a reason. Like, everything has a use case. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a pattern.
There are some bad patterns.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree.
I'm with Peter.
I'm not arguing that you should
I do
until you need it.
Lots and lots of, live code things where I use global variables because it's convenient for doing things very quickly on the fly. It's terrible for like maintainable code.
Oh, yeah.
Global state smells very bad to me.
Yeah, it can be. The solution to it can be as simple as just having a struct and putting them all in there. Even just doing that really does help. I don't know that, I honestly don't think there's a case where you have to use global state.
I didn't say there was, I just said you might.
It's like, don't do it until you have to do it.
So you have to, yeah.
Well, yeah, if someone's got a gun
but you
to
can
your
use a singleton pattern inside of a struct, for example.
Okay.
Right? Like, I'm not saying, like, we're talking global state, and we're just assuming that we're doing it at a global level.
Well, I think
doesn't mean you can't use a singleton pattern inside of code for other reasons.
It wouldn't be a singleton pattern then, would it?
Sure it would.
You wouldn't just have one of them.
No, but you might absolutely do it. If you're compiling, say, you've got a bunch of data in your struct, and you need to formulate it something that's big and expensive, and it's only an operation it's ever going to do once, you'd have a sync.once in your struct. You would do it, and you would just return the cached value at that point. But it's all still contained. It's not global state anymore. So that's what I'm saying. Like, the pattern itself is not bad. It's how we use the pattern that makes it bad. Global state makes the pattern bad. The pattern itself doesn't make the pattern bad.
Right.
Right? Like, you can still use it, but try not to do it globally. Right? There are reasons I use sync.once a lot inside of stuff, and that is a singleton pattern. Sync.once enables singletons. So otherwise, we'd never have sync.once, right?
Yeah, well, no, I use sync once in places where it's not then a singleton, but yeah, I see what
But
you
it
mean.
enables the singleton pattern very well.
I guess it does.
Yeah. So anyway, so to avoid global state, I think we all agree on that.
Yes.
But as a pattern, there are times you might want to use it. You might also use factory patterns a lot, an occasion. We don't use them in Go a lot, but Java loves them. Yeah. They have factories for factories over there.
Yeah.
It's amazing what they do.
It must be massive.
It's like a factory service impl.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need that. I think that's all we've got time for then.
I think so. We need to choose a winner of the plush gopher for the best question. I mean, there's a standout winner for me, but how do we want to
Was it one of
decide
mine?
this? No, obviously
Oh,
not.
okay. I like the what would a year, chapter, year in your life be?
Yeah,
I think, do we all agree? That was a good question, wasn't it? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. No,
Ben,
clearly
you-
not everybody agrees, but yeah, there we go. Gotham, let's show them that arm here that the Yankees are trying to recruit you for. Throw that over there to
Could
them.
you throw that over to...
Come on. Show us that
Oh,
arm.
man.
Come on, really
What
wind
do
it
you
up.
Hey,
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. If Tom Brady ever runs out of the Patriots, we got to recruit you.
I just missed, by the way.
You missed. Oh, then never mind. We're not going to recruit you, yeah.
No, we were doing
You
that
can
for
go to the
podcast.
Yankees. We're completely different sports teams,
Don't
by
forget,
the way.
it's a podcast.
Oh, yeah.
You got it.
We
We'll
got it. You got my
CGI it
homework.
in and
Yeah.
go right to the right place. Yeah. They don't know. They can't see.
I think we have now run out of time, haven't we? So what a
On
great
GoTime.
experience this was. I mean, don't forget, this is not just a podcast. This is also an actual live event in real life, which is this. It's also being live streamed. It's going to be a video. It's going to be a book. We're going to try and get it on Netflix. It's going to be at the
Can you
IMAX.
imagine? You might have to watch this over and over again. I mean,
Yeah.
what do you have
So,
to do with
by the
your
way,
life?
if you do a live podcast like this, when Matt and I were planning it, we may have forgotten to tell the panelists that there was going to be an audience and it was going to be on YouTube. So you can only imagine their lovely faces when we show, oh yeah, it's going to be filmed and live, and Gotham's like, what?
In a way,
Well,
it's
I
not.
knew.
The way I
I
look
knew.
at it is, I think among all the panelists, the people who spoke the most were You both. So enjoy it.
Yeah, that's about right, I think, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's obvious we shouldn't be organizing anything. I mean, that to me is already obvious. It's to the point where it's so obvious, it stops being our fault. That's how I think of it.
So I do actually have one question about this. Did people enjoy it? Should we do this again next year?
Oh, nice.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I like it.
Yeah, well, we should do a proper closing of the show, because podcasts, they at some point have to end.
You just want more applause.
No, I don't want that.
So the thing is, Matt and I don't want to get off stage, 'cause we're not on stage for the rest of the week, except for when we're on stage hosting the conference for the rest of the week. So we really like to
Yeah, no,
soak
I'm
it
just
up.
trying to be professional, and you keep interrupting me and stop me from being professional.
Yeah, well, Kat, why don't you just close us out?
Oh, thank you everyone for coming. We hope you enjoy this, and see most of you tomorrow.
Thank you so
Nice
much.
to
Thank
see
you.
you.
Scene.
And done.